and insult the police. And this is what happens in cities all over. And in fact, this is a quote from the mayor of Berlin in 1843. So this notion that people who are young and single are not going to want to go out and drink and meet other people and stay out late at night is just not a reality. So how do we work to create this sociable city? How do we create vibrancy and safety? So from the perspective of us working with the taxi and transit industry, we focus in on particular zones, what we call hospitality zones in cities, where there's a concentration of activity, where you have events and you have restaurants and bars and theaters, and there's a compact area of concentrated activity that facilitates intergenerational and intercultural socializing, often on 3 time frames: a daytime frame, an evening frame, and a late night frame. And the composition and the makeup and the business and social activity and the demographics of people vary according to these time frames. But people looking for these areas want vibrancy with dining and entertainment, events and festivals. They want public space for markets. They want activity on the sidewalks, but they also want it to be safe. And they want to go into venues where there are they want public safety on the streets. They want crowd management. But most importantly, and increasingly, they want transportation alternatives. So transforming an area and facilitating development and integrating all of the resources necessary requires a broad range of stakeholders. And the panel this afternoon, after I speak, will be representative of the type of organizations that in your city you need to convene to focus in on the challenges of nightlife and transportation. Now, when we work with cities, we've found that there are 6 core areas that need to be addressed. Entertainment options, including dining and events and music and entertainment, the multi-use sidewalk with street vendors and street entertainers and outdoor dining, quality of life in terms of management of trash and litter and public urination and noise and sound, public safety with licensing and permitting and policing and compliance and enforcement, venue safety with security staff and service staff and management of alcohol service and crowd control and dispersing people at closing time. And then finally, the biggest area that I'm going to talk about is transportation and night service and how to integrate this into a traffic safety plan with safe rides and develop taxi stands, facilitate shared rides where you have a minimal pool of resources to provide and meet the needs of a large public, looking at valets and the role they're playing and parking lot safety and DUI or DWI or drunk driving prevention. So transportation and nightlife transportation in particular has these various forces that are expecting your industry and your drivers and the regulators to all come together and say, how are we going to meet the needs of different generations? How are we going to meet the needs of different lifestyles? How are we going to respond to the economy? And how do we look at alcohol and its relationship to nightlife and the opportunities for your industry to be a central part of preventing alcohol-related driving problems? Demographics is what everybody, for the most part, talked about over the past 2 days. And mostly, it's about my generation, the boomer generation, as we call it in the States, that's getting older, that can't get up out of bed as quickly as we used to, that we can't cross the street, so those 30 seconds to cross the street on that flashing sign seems to go down faster than we can get across it. So we have all these challenges as we get older, but we ignore the fact that behind us and behind the children of our generation is a whole new generation that's greater in numbers and has a totally different viewpoint of life than we do. But the people who are making policy decisions are us. So we don't think about or deal with or focus in on anybody but ourselves. So it leads to an interesting little parable. A man was walking through the woods, and he was very thirsty, and he was lost, and he figured he was going to die of thirst. And so he's walking around, and then he comes to a cabin. And in that cabin, he looks around, and he sees a water pump. So he goes in to try to pump the water, but nothing happens. And then he sees in the corner a bottle, and it's filled with water, and he thinks, So he picks up the bottle, takes out the cork, and he was about to drink it when he sees a note. And the note says, use this water to prime the pump and fill the bottle up after you prime the pump and get the water. So he is faced with a decision. He has a bottle of water and he's dying of thirst. Or he has a pump that he has to pour the water into, not knowing necessarily what's going to happen. And so he chooses to pour the water in the pump, and more water comes out than he can ever consume. So he fills up the bottle, he looks around the room, he finds a map, he knows where he is, he knows how to get out, he gets some additional water so he can have water when he leaves, and he writes on the note, it works. So the concept or the idea is that sometimes we have to do things not knowing if it will ever lead to anything. But sometimes if we only think of ourselves, we may lose the potential of what could happen down the road for others. And I think this is a challenge that we face every day as business owners, as government officials. In many ways, all of this austerity, cost-cutting, may in fact lead to something down the road that we may regret. So you have these kind of dimensions when you look at demographics. And we look at birth rates, and you can see the pattern of birth rates going back to the 1920s. And so if we look at these four generations like I did, and look at the birth rates and project forward when people socialize the most, when they're 18 and when they're 50, what would that look like? So I created this chart to give a good example of the patterns of the rate at which people turn 18 and the pattern at which people turn 50. Because when you're 18, what do you think about? And when you're 50, you start thinking about the same thing. And so therefore, you have more freedom to go out and socialize and do things and when your kids are grown as when you didn't have any. So if you look at the growth rate of people turning 18 in the 1970s. And that's the era of the disco. That's the era of nightclubs and nightlife. Then look through the 80s, the drop. Now, there's a little peak there around the 1980 or so, and I attribute that to the Northeast power blackout. So if you go back 18 years, that was when they had that power blackout in the Northeast. But look at the pattern through the 1990s of the turquoise color, and you could see the growth in the number of people turning 18. And then look at the burgundy color bar, and you saw no growth in people turning 50 until, again, the boomers began to come of age. And through the late 90s into the next decade, you're going to have this growing group of people turning 50. But look through 2023, the continued growth of people turning 18 as our generation gets older. And as we get older and start to die off, there are going to be fewer of us, and there are going to be a lot more people under the age of 30 over the next 2 decades. And this is important because if we look at people going out by age, what we know is that people who are young go out more frequently than as they get older. And so what does this have to do with the taxi industry? What does this have to do with transportation? Well, you have these patterns of demographics that are going to drive a need for more people to have places to socialize. And you're seeing this as you travel from city to city. So you have more of that 18 to 30-year-old, many of whom are postponing marriage or having children till later years, especially in today's economy. They're living at home, or they're choosing to postpone the formality of marriage or having children until they perceive the economy getting better. And then you have those over 60, some of whom might have money, some of whom might continue to work because they don't have any savings. But regardless, you're going to see these two generations competing for, demanding places to socialize. Now, I also want to point out a number of other factors, but principally this idea that when I grew up, the orientation of life was family-centered, with a patriarchal structure, living in the suburbs, the father going to the work, and the mother staying at home, and the teenagers being well-behaved and dressing up and asking the girl out on the Saturday night for the date and bringing her a flower. And, you know, they didn't distribute condoms at Ricky Nelson's high school parties. But then you saw this kind of new era of media. And I'm sorry I'm American-centric, but as I travel to Canada, especially Borders, I know you guys get some of these programs too. But what are these programs and how do they differ from that era of the suburban lifestyle? There are no families. For the most part, you hardly see parents in any of these shows. Secondly, it's groups of young people who live together. And where do they live together? In cities, right? And this is simultaneous to the smart growth, new urbanism, let's stop suburban sprawl, to densification of housing in downtown cities and districts with public transit and bicycle paths and all of this other stuff that's concentrating people living in cities. And then we had this explosion on the scene of women finally saying, I could do whatever I want. I could dress like a woman and be like a man and run companies and do whatever I want, and I could go out with my friends and just socialize and not necessarily go out to meet men. And so there's a whole new generation of women who are coming through the ranks that are going to reshape and redefine our society in ways that we may not know will happen. And we're not even sure how the new young generation is going to impact and affect all of this. So the reason I'm giving you all of this background is because a lot of time was spent about how you're going to create cab service and paratransit service for the aging population. But where is the discussion? Where's the strategies? Where's the incentives to look at the nighttime economy as really being part of an untapped area that could ultimately be the future economic engine of your industry? Because you have these social generations, the singles, the mingles, the families, and the jingles. The singles are the unattached people who are going out to meet people. And so they want the dance clubs, they want the places to move around, they want to be able to show to each other what they got. Mingles are couples or social groups that get together. They want a different environment where they can sit and eat and drink and socialize and listen to entertainment. Families, for the most part, have fewer opportunities to socialize just because of their lifestyle. One thing that somebody in Calgary and Edmonton pointed out to me, and I've been noticing it more, you know that chart I showed you of the people turning 18? Well, they were born in 1980. That's the beginning of that wave. So that